Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Career Advice Series webinar, Legal Technology and Innovation, a Framework and Skills for Success. My name is Emily Roshek, Director of ABA Legal Career Central, a career center that offers both career development resources and a job board for law students, lawyers, and other legal professionals across all disciplines and career stages. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Professor Dan Linna. Dan is the Director of Legal R&D, the Center for Legal Services Innovation, and a Professor of Law in residence at Michigan State University College of Law. Dan is also an Adjunct Professor of Law at the University of Michigan Law School. Dan teaches legal innovation and technology classes at MSU, including quantitative analysis. At the University of Michigan Law School, Dan has taught negotiation for several years. Beginning in January 2018, Dan will teach a legal technology and innovation class at the University of Michigan Law School. Before law school, Dan was an information technology manager and a consultant. Dan graduated magna cum laude from the University of Michigan Law School. After law school, he clerked for 1 year at the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit. Before joining MSU 3 years ago, Dan was an equity partner in the litigation department of Honigman, Miller, Schwartz, and Cohen. Dan, thank you so much for being here. I will turn it over to you.
Great, thank you, Emily. Well, I'm going to jump right into our content because we're going to try to cover a lot of ground. And we're going to move kind of fast through a few of these areas. We will make, I'm going to clean up the slide just a tiny bit and we'll make them available after the webinar. But the purpose of this is to hopefully give you a framework to think about kind of how the legal industry is changing and also to think about your careers within the legal industry. But then I'll also want to start demystifying some of the technologies that you're hearing about. So for some of you, if you haven't already been introduced to these topics, it'll be new and you're not going to take away everything. But the idea is just to start exposing you to these things. And even for those of you who've heard this many times, I think what we find, of course, in learning is that we need to be exposed to information in a lot of different formats and multiple times before it all starts sinking in. And frankly, I think a lot of these contents, all of us are really trying to get a handle on how the world is changing around us with technology. So, some of these are difficult things to kind of piece together, and they're going to be different for each of you as well to think about what these things mean for your practice. But with that, let's get going. And you've seen the headlines, right? Here come the robot lawyers, and there's a lot of talk about robots practicing law and software replacing lawyers doing things like document review, and talk of software being able to do more and more advanced things that lawyers in the past have done. And earlier this year, this is just one example of it, JP Morgan released some information about having created software that now does in seconds what took lawyers 360,000 hours to do previously. And that's annually, right? So these applications are having an impact on the work that lawyers do. And so much so that you've also seen the headlines, right, about lawyers being replaced by computers. Now, this doesn't just affect companies like JP Morgan and big law firms. It also, we're seeing change in legal aid organizations. You look at Michigan Legal Help, and they've got do-it-yourself kits. They're using expert systems to help self-represented litigants handle a variety of legal tasks. Illinois Legal Aid Online and a lot of other legal aid organizations across the country are building these self-help portals and tools. Of course, LegalZoom has been around for quite some time, and people have been using those for wills and trusts and to set up companies, things like that, and their business model is evolving as well. They acquired a law firm in the UK. We've got online dispute resolution. Some of you might be familiar with the company Modria, which resolves millions of disputes for eBay. In my backyard, my colleague at the University of Michigan, J.J. Prescott, is a founder of Matterhorn, and their court innovation software does online dispute resolution for courts around the country. And so we're seeing things change all across the industry. And then we're seeing companies, legal companies like ThinkSmart, Neotologic, they're building expert systems, process automation tools, right, that lawyers and legal departments are using to codify some of their knowledge, to add technology and improve and automate various processes. And we've seen an explosion of legal startups. And I say legal startups, not legal tech startup, because they're not all based on technology. And we're going to talk about this, about not all of these innovations are just about technology. But some of them are definitely technology-based, and so like Kira Systems, for example, using artificial intelligence to analyze contracts, and specifically in this use case, it's mostly focused on due diligence in transactions. Lex Machina, a data source about intellectual property cases. They've got about 15 years worth of data and starting to get into advanced analytics so that clients in trademark and copyright and patent disputes have information about parties and attorneys and how judges handle cases. And probably many of you have heard about ROS intelligence, right? Using artificial intelligence as part of the research and knowledge management process. So we're definitely really seeing a lot of things change with technology. And then also we're also seeing a lot of process outsourcing. And there's a variety of players in this space. Elevate is one of them, a company that in many ways started out as a legal process outsourcing company, kind of looking at tasks that were done here in the US and recognizing that these could be outsourced to countries like India, South Africa, Ireland, done by very competent lawyers, done very well, so improving not just efficiency but quality in many instances. And many of those companies now have started to really expand their services, and they're providing technology solutions and other services. So we really see that innovation and technology is having a tremendous impact now in the legal industry. And it really shouldn't be a surprise to us, because we've seen innovation and technology revolutionizing several other industries. Uber with taxis, Airbnb with hotels, Amazon with the retail space. We're seeing financial services impacted in fintech, and we're seeing medical services change, IBM Watson being used by doctors, things like that. And should we have really expected law to be any different? And of course, now the legal industry has lagged for a lot of reasons, including because we're basically self-governing as lawyers and have a monopoly on the delivery of legal services. But some of those barriers now are breaking down, and we're definitely seeing change in the industry. We're seeing large law firms get into the fray now, using artificial intelligence to get work done, hiring data scientists, launching technology and innovation incubators. Brian Cave has launched one. Denton's has an incubator, and quite a few other law firms now are looking at revolutionizing the practice of law, as it says on this Brian Cave announcement. Cypher Shah is using robotics and automating some of the things that it's done to get more efficient and improve the quality of the work that it's doing. Right, so this has caused, and many of you have probably heard of Richard Susskind. He's been writing quite a bit in this space for quite some time now about how technology is impacting the legal industry. And he wrote a book a little while back called The End of Lawyers, and it was a bit more positive of a book called Tomorrow's Lawyers. And actually, Richard released an updated version of this book. I'd highly recommend it for all of you who are interested in this space. And if you're in the legal industry, you definitely ought to be interested in this space. But it does raise an interesting question as far as, what's really happening? How is the industry really changing? And I think a really nice way to look at it, to try to simplify and get our arms around what's happening here, is to think about the change that we're seeing in terms of people, process, and technology. So it's not just technology, but we're also seeing changes in the people aspect, how we deliver legal services, how we deliver solutions to legal problems, and on the process component of this. So if you think about law traditionally, right, it's very people-focused and mostly focused on the lawyers. Right? The lawyers are the ones who deliver value. And one of the things that we're seeing are there are opportunities for others to deliver value. Some of you might be aware of limited license legal technicians, triple LTs. Those are in place now in the state of Washington. Basically, a limited license, so they're equivalent to lawyers in certain specific areas of law. They can deliver solutions like lawyers can in those spaces. And so we're seeing more and more opportunities for other people other than full-blown lawyers to deliver value. And this is expanded to project managers, people in marketing and business development, and of course technologists. And we're seeing more and more hybrid positions as well. Lawyers who have a JD from a law school, for example, but who are trained in technology or data analytics, process improvement, project management, playing kind of a hybrid role where they're not providing legal advice directly, but are in a role to help facilitate the efficient provision of high quality legal advice, which will help deliver better outcomes for clients. The other thing that's related to this is that there's been very little thought given to process, very little thought given to technology until recently. And so when you think about what's happening, traditionally lawyers would get matters from their clients, whether it's a business or even an individual, and the lawyer would handle the whole matter, and then at the end of the matter, give a bill to the client. You know, and maybe 30 or 40 years ago, especially if you were in a larger law firm, the client might give you a transaction or a litigation matter, and you as the lawyer would come back at the conclusion of it and say, and give them a bill for services rendered $100,000, say, for example. And the clients, for the most part, would just pay those bills, and that's the way it worked. But now what we're seeing is that we're seeing the disaggregation of legal work. And whether it's a simple task or even a very complex task, lawyers in legal departments and in law firms and individual lawyers and even at legal aid organizations, we're seeing this, are disaggregating legal work, breaking it down into its component parts, breaking into discrete tasks and processes, and asking questions about, well, who should be doing the work? Now, what's the level of lawyer who should be doing the work? Should we make or buy? And that's a decision corporations make all the time when they have to decide how something gets done. And outsourcing and other components of corporations has been very common, and now it's kind of a new thing in the legal department where they're saying, well, we could do this internally rather than asking our outside law firm to do it. Then the other question, of course, then becomes, well, if you've got a good handle on certain components of a legal matter, it could be outsourced. It could be sent to a legal process outsourcer who might be able to do it much more efficiently even here in the U.S. or whatever country you're located in, or maybe they would send it somewhere else in the world to be done. And then, of course, automating legal work. So using technology to automate the provision of advice or review of documents and things like that. And so what we're really seeing is a development of a legal supply chain. It's starting to look like in other industries where you don't have just one purchaser and one supplier, right? Kind of like the clients and the law firms. Well, now there are many, many, many other people trying to get a piece of that demand for solutions to legal problems. Many more entities providing legal services. And so, as I alluded to, it's really one big part of this is the law firms leading change in this space, and the legal departments, and they're expecting much more from their law firms. Some of this is in the form of RFPs or requests for proposals, where they're asking the law firms to tell them how are you using technology, how to use process improvement methodologies like lean thinking, Lean Six Sigma, design thinking, project management is a really important part of that. How do they have metrics? You know, how are they going to measure the efficiency and the quality of their work? And how are they using data analytics? Are they using sources like Lex Machina and other resources, or capturing data about the matters that they complete so they can use that data to get better results in the future? And so we're seeing a lot of collaboration then too, where law firms and their clients are working together, recognizing that by using some of the disciplines we'll talk about today, they can improve the quality of legal services. And it just requires taking the effort to do so, right? Having the commitment to do that. And then we're also seeing convergence, where legal departments are using fewer and fewer law firms. And many corporations have gone through really aggressive convergence programs. They may come to the realization that, well, we have 500 law firms that are doing work for us. And, well, why is that? Well, we've never really organized how we choose law firms. What if we tried to identify, well, you know, what's a panel of, say, 30 or 50 law firms who really should be our core law firms doing a majority of our work? Right? And so we're seeing some of this going through convergence programs. And we're seeing some of them tell their outside law firms that when they go through this disaggregation process, they're going to expect law firms to work with another law firm that might be their competitor. Right? So the environment is really changing a lot in that space, and a lot of it is led by the corporate legal departments. We've seen the rise of groups like the ACC Legal Operations Group and the Corporate Legal Operations Group. And both these organizations are growing wildly. And they're hiring people into their legal departments that are really looking at, again, not solving the legal problems directly, but asking how can we use technology, data, improve processes, project management to deliver better results, right? Working closely with the lawyers, and that's where they're most effective as well. Now, so one of the things that we're going to touch on as far as on the next couple of slides, I just want to start walking through what are the disciplines and skills that we're really talking about. And of course, I'm the director of legal R&D at Michigan State Law, and we've built a curriculum around this. Right? We introduce students to delivering legal services, how things are evolving. I teach quantitative analysis for lawyers, introducing empirical methods, we do some programming in Python, the purpose of which is just to learn about different data science tools, and really then demystify how artificial intelligence works, how data-driven decision-making can be implemented in law firms and things like that. And then a few other courses I teach a litigation, data theory, practice and process, entrepreneurial lawyering. We start getting the more substantive areas where most of what we've been talking about so far is about legal service delivery. Of course, there are great opportunities for lawyers to provide value at the intersection of law and technology. So what kind of laws are we going to have when we have autonomous vehicles? What kind of privacy concerns do we have in this more and more connected world, things like that. And then legal analytics, e-discovery, and then a lot of co-curricular activities where we get out and work with entities to try to develop these skills and also provide value through the field work and things that we're doing. And you'll notice social media on here as well, right? And that's definitely a good way to learn about this, being on Twitter. Hopefully you saw my Twitter handle on that first slide. Definitely encourage you to take advantage of social media as a way to learn, build your brand, be connected in the world to see what's happening, what's going on. And so a lot of what we're talking about at Michigan State and hear a lot of others in the environment talk about is that what we really need are T-shaped lawyers. And this is a concept that really came from IBM, where they recognized that their consultants were best not just when they had deep information technology expertise, which of course that's a given, right? To be a good lawyer, you need deep domain expertise. You got to know the law, right? But a lot of people know the law. So what is it that's really going to make someone successful? And what we're seeing emerge here is there's a different set of skills that clients really value. There's a different set of skills that really help differentiate one good lawyer from another good lawyer. So some of this is the business of law, really just being aware of legal operations. And when I call it a business, that doesn't mean just in law firms would you need to be aware of this. Even if you're in a legal aid organization, you have limited resources, you're serving clients, you have processes internally to serve as many clients as possible. How do you run that? How do you think of process improvement, project management? How do you manage your knowledge so you're not reinventing the wheel time and again? Right? The goal in each one of these organizations is very similar. It's to help as many people as possible, to measure outcomes, make sure you're actually making a difference with the hours that you spend doing things. So we see these same disciplines being very important, whether it's legal aid or a court or a legal department in a corporation or in a law firm. So process improvement, project management, knowledge management, metrics, data analytics, and technology. And we're going to talk about each one of these a little bit during this webinar. So the business of law is really, there's a couple of components, right? One, I was just talking about delivering legal services, but then also understanding clients and their business. And for most of you, that's probably something that you get if you've been practicing for a little bit of time. Surprisingly, there are some lawyers who don't seem to understand how important that is, but it's of growing importance, particularly when you see how the legal departments are changing. And there's a greater expectation that the lawyers know not just the law, but really understand their client's business. And for those of you who are in law school, this is something important to understand as well, all of these disciplines, all these skills, as far as being a way that you can differentiate yourself. And students frequently worry about getting too narrow. But for the most part, I don't think you can get too narrow. And when you start learning one area, it really positions you well to expand and then to pivot to other related areas, right? So with a lot of the things that we're talking about, pick one. Ideally, pick one that you're really interested in. I mean, ideally what you can find here is what your passion is and what you really want to do, and then find a way to pursue it in this space. We're fortunate to have the General Counsel of General Motors, Craig Glidden, at MSU Law on Wednesday night. And a quote from him was, "Everyone looks pretty much the same in a blue suit. What am I going to do to differentiate myself?" And he was talking about when he first started in practice. And that's such a great insight, right? Just recognizing that more and more the clients are looking at lawyers and saying, well, I know you know torts and contract law. I know you could help me, but why should I pick you versus the 100 or 1,000 or 10,000 other lawyers who could help me, right? And so the things we're talking about in this presentation are some of the things that you can latch on to really differentiate yourself. I also wanted to mention the business model canvas, and some of you have some familiarity with this, but most of you probably do not. And the business model canvas is just something to think about as a tool to use to identify what is your value proposition. You know, who are the people who are going to pay you if you're in law school, for example, or if you're a junior associate? Why is it someone is going to pay $150, $250, $500 an hour for you to help them with their legal problem, right? What's your value proposition? Who are the customers that would pay you to help them do things? Who are the people going to support you? What would be your revenue streams? Right? This is just a useful tool to think about, and as far as how to ask the right questions to think about your career. So that's kind of a part of the business side, just a piece of it and a couple of tools to get you thinking about it. Process improvement is something that is really important. And sometimes when I talk to lawyers about process improvement, they say, well, what are you talking about? I don't really have processes. I talk to the client, and they tell me what their problem is, and I solve their problem, right? And you know, I think a lot of people, maybe it's intuitive or they embed it, but what we're seeing more and more is we want to make all of that explicit. We want to figure out, for so many of these matters, where, if we could kind of come together and look at it, would we kind of identify patterns where legal matters vary, but they consist of similar components. And when we recognize what those components are, we can improve them. We can make them work better. We can be not just more efficient, but we can improve the quality. We can figure out how to introduce technology. And so we can develop best practices and standard work. And a matter of fact, there have been a couple of studies in this space, one by Frank Levy and Dana Remus, where they came to the conclusion that a relatively low percentage of legal work could be automated because we don't really have best practices and standards. And for me, that raises the question is like, well, why aren't we developing more best practices and standards? And by doing so, we don't necessarily need technology. We could make a heck of an impact just looking at the way we do things, and after we get done doing something, asking, well, how could we make that better? How could we improve it? How could we have best practices and standards around that? And Richard Susskind talks about kind of this continuum of legal service delivery, and he talks about bespoke work. And if you're someone who's been in the UK before, you'll recognize that, and it's the idea of like kind of like every suit you make, it's a bespoke, tailored suit made from whole cloth. But of course, most of us don't buy suits that way anymore. We've found places where they've become commodities. Commodity doesn't mean just cheap necessarily, but it's like the idea that you could go into a suit store and get a decent suit for $500 or $300, right? We've figured out how to make them in a standardized, systemized, packaged way. And the more we look at different legal services, we're finding that there are things where, especially when we break it apart into its component parts, that certain things don't need to be bespoke, kind of reinvent the wheel every time. We can standardize things. We can systematize things. There are ways to package solutions. And some things become, in fact, commoditized. And so one of the process improvement methodologies that we work a lot with in our legal R&D program is lean thinking, which really comes from Toyota, the Toyota production system. And here's a Harvard Business Review article from 6 years ago talking about the way lean knowledge work can be applied. Lean can be applied to knowledge work. And, right, I mean, a lot of times I hear lawyers say, well, you know, what I do requires judgment and expertise, right? But lean is something that works very well in that environment. And we're seeing, in fact, used a lot in the healthcare industry. We've had great success in the projects we've worked on using lean. One of the seminal books is Lean Thinking by Womack and Jones. You'll notice here on this circle that a foundation of lean is identifying who the customers are and specifying what the value is. And the idea is it's very customer-centric. You look at, well, what I'm doing, how does that produce value for the client? What does the client really want, right? That's the client defines value. And you spend some time mapping the value stream, just kind of thinking about what are the things you do that provide value. You can think about a transaction or a litigation matter. Think about all the things you do as a lawyer from beginning to end. And what are the things that you do in that process that really generate the greatest value for clients? Right? So when you start thinking about automating different things and machines taking over, I'm sure you as the lawyer, you can think about areas where, okay, maybe those are repeatable areas here and there, and I can see where a machine could do it better. But then you think about the relationship aspects of it and where you're really acting as a trusted advisor and other things that you do that a machine is not going to be replacing you anytime soon. And then some of these areas, of course, are areas, a lot of these areas would be areas where you're thinking about, well, how do I use the data? How do I use predictions from a machine to help me do the job better? And as it's described, the idea that a human or a machine alone is not nearly as good as a human and a machine together. So lean generally is getting the most value for the customer with the least amount of resources and the shortest overall lead time. Now, the keys are that the customer defines value, so we're always looking at the customer. How do we do things better for the customer? Its foundation is the scientific method for knowledge creation. And another core principle is respect for people. And where that applies so much, too, is when we start talking about innovation. The idea for respect for people. In the Toyota production system, the people who are closest to providing the value, building a vehicle or speaking directly to the client in the case of lawyers, for example, or doing the work and as an associate, those are the people that you really want to empower and see them contributing to your innovation efforts. And if you're asking someone to spend hours and hours reviewing documents on a screen, it really shows a lack of respect for humanity to ask someone to do that work, that drudgery, right? And the idea is that, well, we can empower people to do something that adds more value. Let's automate where we can and empower people to add more value. And one of the things that's really important to think is lean has kind of gotten a bad rap as just kind of a cost-cutting tool. But it's more than efficiency. It's about improving quality and getting better outcomes. Because all of us who practice for any period of time, I think we could all find areas where, yes, we could get more efficient. And when we find ways to come up with best practices and standards, what we find that also improves quality, that also helps us get better outcomes. And what I have here is the improvement kata, which is something that's used within Toyota, like it's a coaching methodology. And this is really the embodiment of the basic scientific method. And the idea here is, I think this is a really, really great framework. And you know, Jeff Leiker and Mike Rother talk a lot about this at the University of Michigan. Mike Rother's written a few books about it. But it's a nice framework to think about you individually. But if you're a lawyer, you're also a leader. And you've got to lead teams. Some of you might be leading an organization. You should be thinking about a model like this, right? You as the leader need to help set the direction or the challenge for the people you're working with. Or maybe you're thinking even just about your own challenge that you're setting. And then you kind of assess, well, where are we now? What's the current condition? And then set a shorter term goal, right? You're not going to go to the moon all in one step, right? You've got to set some intermediate goals. And you can apply this. This is a meta skill you can apply to darn near anything as far as problem solving. And again, it's the basic scientific method. But one of the key things is what we do too frequently as lawyers, or even when we think we're being innovators and coming up with something new. You know, we get in a room, we make a lot of assumptions, we jump to conclusions, and we think we've got the new answer, the next best thing, and then we just go and start doing it, right? Well, this process recognizes, as does lean startup and design thinking, that we don't know the answers. And what we have to do is we have to conduct experiments. We have to go out there and start trying things. And sometimes when you talk to lawyers, this doesn't resonate with them because in Silicon Valley, right, they talk about fail fast. And that's the last thing you want to talk to lawyers about that. Well, we want to fail fast. Right? So I like to focus on the idea of learn fast. We're going to try some things. We're going to make small changes in the way we deliver a service or something that we do, maybe just on client intake, for example, or how we record our time, to see if it improves our efficiency, see if we get better results, try little experiments to keep improving, right? And so this is a really nice framework. And one thing when you're managing teams, too, you hear sometimes people will complain about being micromanaged, or on the other end, right, just not being given any direction, not understanding, no support. Right? And I think this framework really can help you figure out, as the leader of a team of people, which even junior associates, you're a leader, right? You're leading projects and teams, thinking about, well, how do I put a framework in place so that I'm empowering the people I work with to understand what the bigger picture challenge is, and then coaching them to figure out where they are now and empowering them to figure out like how we're going to get to the next step. That's when you really can create a learning organization and produce a lot of value. And the idea when you're running these experiments is kind of going through the process of plan, do, study, act. And too frequently in the legal industry, we're so busy doing stuff that we don't spend enough time kind of studying. And I'm going to talk about project management in a minute, but one of the key principles of project management, we see a lot of law firms now implementing it. Some of them are using it more really just in the planning side and the estimate fees and things like that, which is an improvement, absolutely, to do that in level setting expectations and setting up a communication plan. But what we really need to see more of is doing a retrospective, looking at, well, what did we do? How did it go? And talking to our clients about that, especially as well. How did we do? How can we get better? How can we keep improving? Right? And that's the key of conducting these experiments, going through that process. And again, there's design thinking. A lot of you have heard about design thinking. Frankly, these disciplines are much more the same than they are different. And so what I hope you'll take away from this presentation today is really just a couple of key things that I'd like to mention, right? Is that whether it's lean thinking, design thinking, Six Sigma, it all comes back to having customer focus. And you don't know what your customer is going to value, what they need. So as soon as possible, you want to start prototyping or trying things to test it, following the scientific method. But talk to your customers. If you think you have a tool that consumers will want or other lawyers will want, start talking to the people who you think would want it as soon as possible. Interview them, talk to them, many, many, many of them. But what you're trying to do is develop learning organizations, right? That's one of the other principles behind this, especially coming from the Toyota production system, from lean thinking. You want to lead and empower people to continuously improve, innovate, and deliver greater value, and you want to be doing those things yourself. Okay, so project management, sometimes it gets blurry as far as, well, what's process improvement versus project management? Process improvement you can think about as a little bit of a higher level up, kind of like some of it is daily operations, what's going on inside your organization, or you can think about it as like, well, what's my process for handling a lawsuit? What's my process for an M&A deal, right? Kind of the higher level. When one lands in your desk, hey, client was sued. Hey, client wants to acquire this target. Now you're talking about project management. So kind of a temporary activity to produce a unique product, service, or a result. And about 5 years ago, there was still a fair amount of talk about waterfall project management, which I'll summarize and say was kind of more like sitting here today and thinking that you're going to plan out what you might be doing 2 or 3 months down the road for a legal project. The software industry has really pivoted now to agile project management. So they undertake these sprints to get work done and kind of reconnect and figure out kind of what needs to be done next, right? And so they can be much more agile as far as adjusting their course. And what we found is that kind of agile project management and different variants of it, like Scrum, are very effective in the legal environment to manage teams, to work with the client, and to really check in and make sure that what you're doing each step of the way is delivering maximum value to the client. So again, project management, usually you'll hear it broken down in the 4 phases: initiate, plan, execute, close. There's different ways it's broken down, but what I really want to highlight is just it's so critically important to have this retrospective. And frankly, in the legal industry, we don't take the time to do that. Those of us who are senior people, it's so important we take the time to give feedback to junior people we're training. What are the lessons learned? What was done well? What could be done better? What needs to be done differently? And doing that same thing with the client, sitting down and saying, hey, how did that go? How can we serve you better? Where are there opportunities to provide greater value? Those are really important conversations to be having. Knowledge management, this is another really big area, but it really breaks down to capturing, organizing, and recalling who you know, and how you do what you do. And of course, we're talking mostly here about how it is you do what you do. And we're finding more and more artificial intelligence tools, expert systems, data-driven decision-making, more and more tools in this space that can really help us. There's a lot that could be said about knowledge management, but that's really all we're going to say here is just to make sure you're thinking about what you do in terms of knowledge management, how do you avoid reinventing the wheel, and many additional applications beyond that. All right, so I want to start getting into metrics, data, and technology now, which is going to be a key part of this presentation as we go through the last 25 minutes. So I'd like you to think about legal technology in 3 buckets, and there's a lot of different ways to break it down. But so first of all, there's basic technology, Word, Excel, PDFs, and thinking about how you use those tools to produce results. There's lots of opportunities here to provide greater value, knowing how to use those tools. Too many lawyers don't know how to use Excel effectively. Clients notice that. Clients want to send you financial information. It's hard to manage that information properly if you don't know how to use Excel. There are more and more opportunities to use Word properly to create better documents, better briefs, create briefs that have properly functioning hyperlinks so that judges can easily access case law when you file a brief and they read it on their iPad, things like that. But there are also more and more, there's a growing number of competencies that you need to have as an attorney. And you think about Rule 1.8 in the technological competency requirements. And even without the the comments to the rules, your duties of competence as a lawyer and needing to understand e-discovery. I'm actually doing this call from California right now, and there's some really stringent requirements in place for you as a lawyer to understand e-discovery issues, but more and more cloud computing, case management systems, knowing those things and know how to navigate. Intermediate, I'd say document automation and expert systems, document automation tools to help you so you don't just have a Word document as a precedent for doing something, but there's actually a framework, there's a workflow tool you go through to help you populate information into documents. It may even include an expert system component where it'll provide to you suggested clauses, like this ought to be the default, but here's reasons why you might choose different information in your document that we're helping you create. And then advanced things like machine learning, natural language processing, and artificial intelligence. What you're going to see is that a lot of this is being driven by data. And so sometimes you'll hear talk about big data and then technology like there's something different, but a lot of what we're talking about in technology, including artificial intelligence, is being driven by the data. So there's quite a bit of overlap here. So automation being driven in the sense by data. And then data analytics, right, and thinking about how you can use that for litigation, for compliance, for transactions, and I'm going to lay out some of that. But a lot of this is also about data-driven decision making. And if you're a lawyer, frequently what we do as a lawyer, we tell people we should hire us because I'm an expert. I've done this 100 times, and I'm one of the best, if not the best, at doing this, right? And our client will say, okay, well, how much is it going to cost, and what do you think the outcome is going to be? And then we throw our hands up. I don't know. I mean, there's all kinds of things that could happen. It's so difficult to estimate, yada, 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 right? Well, clients more and more, they're refusing to accept that. And at a minimum, so part of this goes back to process, and if we have good processes and standards and best practices in place, we can give better estimates on outcomes and fees, things like that. But at a minimum, what we're expecting is for us to start putting some metrics in place and asking the client what's important to them, have some benchmarks, establish some metrics for efficiency, quality, and use small data. So maybe you don't know exactly what's going to happen in this matter, but if you can tell the client, well, the last 20 times that we did this, 60% of the time it cost about this, and this is the outcome we had. 20% it looked like this, 10 this, and 10 that. Better yet, then if you can start adding, and we think when it's 60% of the time like this, we think these are some of the factors that result in it playing out that way. Right? Those are the kind of insights they're looking for. And of course, you have anecdotes and you have intuitions, and you can ask your colleagues and others about the particular judge or the lawyer on the other side of a transaction and things like that. That's all valuable. But more and more, what clients are looking for, and we as lawyers ought to be doing, is looking for data that can really give us a foundation to supplement those anecdotes and those intuitions. A lot about what we're talking about with data is really about prediction, right? And my friends Dan Katz and Mike Bomarito write about prediction in 3 cents: experts, crowds, and algorithms. And you think about it, we as the lawyers, we do our prediction, and sometimes we're our sole predictor, right? With one lawyer in the case, and we decide, what the transaction should close for, what the matter is worth, things like that. But in other industries, they're figuring out ways to use crowds or crowds of super experts and algorithms, right? And blending those things together to get better results. And that's this relates to a lot of what we're seeing with artificial intelligence. Okay, so what's an algorithm? And that's a scary word to a lot of people, but it's really pretty simple, right, at its basic. It's a step-by-step procedure for solving a problem or accomplishing some end, especially by a computer. Right? So it's a recipe in essence. Okay. Now that's an oversimplification maybe for some, but that's a good starting point in thinking about when you think about an algorithm being used to go through data and make a prediction. Right? Think about this definition. So the first thing I want to talk about then is rules-based artificial intelligence. And this idea is that you take a human expert and works with a knowledge engineer, and now more and more we're seeing people who are defined as legal knowledge engineers or legal solutions architects. They'll work with the expert lawyer, and they'll figure out a way to say, well, how could we put a decision tree together? How could we put all the rules together in a way that you could picture this flow chart that would help people get to the right result? So a lot of the artificial intelligence research has maybe not produced as many returns as some had expected in this space. And what we're going to talk about is now the rise of data-driven artificial intelligence that's producing driverless cars, machine learning, things like that. But there's a lot of opportunity here for expert systems in the law, in particular because we haven't really spent time coming up with best practices and standards in a lot of spaces. The best way to think about this is it's TurboTax for law. And we're seeing a lot of legal problems that can be solved just as any of you would use TurboTax to do your taxes. We're seeing, this is a tool from Dentons for a compliance tool for European financial regulatory changes. Foley has built a Foreign Corrupt Practices Act tool around this. And then there's the Ackerman Data Loss Center, which is I think is a great example, and I wrote a blog post about this, where, and I'm a fan in part because I did data breach litigation, and I had scenarios where clients would call, they have an incident or a spill, and they want to find out what are their obligations. And you might get a bunch of attorneys working on doing the legal research in the different jurisdictions to figure out, well, what are the answers? And what Jeff Scherer did at Ackerman is find some clients who were interested in these problems and to say that I think there's a better way to do it. I think we can build an expert system. So we use Neota Logic, and they've built out the rules to kind of figure out, you can put in some information about what sort of an incident you have, where the data is stored, what kind of data it was, what jurisdictions you do business in. And it tells you what kind of notice requirements are in different states, different jurisdictions around the globe, things like that. So it's an expert system in Neota Logic, and it's backed, right? There's a process outsourcing piece of it too, where Thomson Reuters as a managed service provides the legal research to do that. Paul Stroka is the person he works with at Thomson Reuters. So I think that's a really interesting application, and we're going to see more expert systems come up like that, especially done this way where it's collaborative, it's working with the client, it's disaggregating something. And of course, there's plenty of opportunities to provide bespoke, high-end, valuable advice around that. This doesn't answer all of the questions, but they're pieces of that process that could be put into a box, really, right? There's the solution off the shelf right there. And we're seeing tools like ThinkSmart, and I mentioned Neota Logic, being used for process automation. This is a tool for creating non-disclosure agreements. Right? If you're a lawyer and you're doing non-disclosure agreements where you pull up a Word template and change it, and then maybe you have different people using different templates, right? That's definitely not the way to go. It's something that can be automated, right? And we're seeing most organizations now doing stuff like that that is automated. All right, what about data-driven artificial intelligence? Well, we're going to run through this kind of fast, right? But again, we're trying to demystify this from a high level. But when you think about machine learning, what I want you to take away from this is there's a couple of different types. There's categorical and continuous. So categorical, you could think of like a spam filter on your computer. Right? Your machine learning on your computer, when it comes in your email box, it makes a decision. Spam, not spam, right? It's classifying, it's dropping it into one of those two buckets. Or then continuous, right? And you could say continuous would be like, well, if I wanted to predict what I think a lawyer's rate ought to be, that could be a number from 0 to presumably infinity, right? It's a continuous range of values. And then we have supervised machine learning and unsupervised. Supervised means that you have a human being who would train the computer. You would have a training set of data. You'd have labeled data. And in the spam filter example, you would take some input where someone would mark email, it's either spam or not spam. And you could keep improving. The system would keep learning based on your marking email, right? If it gets it right and it puts something in the spam folder, that's where you'd be training the system. If it gets it wrong on something in your inbox that should have been in spam, you mark it properly now, and you're training the system. Then the unsupervised pieces of this is really using algorithms to, like, say you have a corpus of documents, a large set of documents. You could throw an algorithm at it without doing any training and get it to drop it into different clusters of information, finding attributes that would figure out ways to create lines between the information. And then there's continuous dimension reduction that's unsupervised. And the best way to think of that is just like if there's a lot of different features that might be driving outcomes or helping predict, being predictive, that it would help reduce the number of those and figure out which ones are most important. I'm not going to spend much time on this slide, but this is just a nice slide from a plugin for Python, scikit-learn, just thinking about what kind of data, what kind of analysis you want to do. And when you have a minute, if you go to this website, just kind of look, it like really leads you through it. And it'll point you to different algorithms that you can use to accomplish these different categories of machine learning that we were just talking about. But you encounter machine learning and artificial intelligence all the time now, everywhere. Think about when you go to Amazon and you look at a book and Amazon says, hey, customers that bought this one also bought others, and right, and they're taking into consideration your buying habits and a lot of other data to serve up other examples. When you're on Netflix, they, based on what you've watched in the past, it'll suggest movies that it thinks you'll want to watch, right? Apparently watching the Steve Jobs One Last Thing also results in not seeing more Steve Jobs movies, some historical movies, and also Safe Haven. You know? How they come up with that exactly, we don't know, right? But this is all based on probabilistic estimates based on other data, and that's how they populate these things. One of the great examples, I think, is that a lot of us use Google Maps or Waze, right? And I think as a lawyer, think about a tool where when we take all this data and we could have a platform, and this really helps think about the idea of humans working with machines as well, right? But think about this when you say, I want to go from A to B, and you plug it in, and it kind of tells you about where there's some of the roadblocks. Where are there rough roads? Where might there be a regulator who's going to be looking closely at something, right? How do you need to navigate this space? What are the different routes you can take and how long it might take and the different obstacles you might encounter on those different routes, right? We use Waze and these sort of tools, and we figure out, on this particular day, for me to drive from Detroit to the University of Michigan Law School, if I left at 2:45 in the afternoon, 47 minutes, but if I waited till 6, an hour and 6, that's really valuable information, right? And this is based on a huge set of data they have, and they're making predictions, right? They're making predictions about how long it'll take me to get from Detroit to Ann Arbor in this particular case. And thinking about how can we have platforms and workflows like that for lawyers to help us with these things. So we're seeing machine learning now be used in more and more places to help with technology-assisted review of documents for e-discovery and diligence. Folks are trying to use it for compliance, to identify issues before they become a problem, proactive law, right, which is something I'd really encourage you to think about. How do we do more than just clean up messes when they happen, but actually prevent problems for clients? And then quantitative legal prediction in litigation and in transactions, so predicting results. On technology-assisted document review, probably quite a few of you are familiar with this, right? And it's good to understand this, to think about sampling techniques. So this idea, let's say you have 10 million documents. If you look at, let's say, 10,000 of the documents or even 100,000 of the documents, you'd be labeling that data. You're training the system based on a sample, a random sample of the documents. You think this first pass review, and anyone's done first pass review, you see what you see. What you get is a bunch of documents from different custodians. I mean, some of the stuff is obviously not relevant. Now there's a going away party, or someone's talking about their plans to go out for the weekend, things like that, clearly not relevant, right? Then there's other stuff that is clearly relevant, or it's clearly privileged, things like that. And so how can you train the system to help make those obvious calls? And time and again, when these different technology-assisted review, there's now we're getting into technology-assisted review 2.0 and more advanced processes. But how do you, when these have been tested, what we found is it outperforms humans doing reviews. And for a lot of reasons, right? When you're reviewing documents for 10 hours, human beings make mistakes, right? We're not really built to do that kind of thing. And then there's just other things like you click the wrong button and what have you too, to say whether a document is relevant or not. Could you use the same sort of data to predict the lawyer's rate, right? If you know particular features, can you predict that? Turns out that's a great problem for regression, right? And that is an algorithm used for artificial intelligence. And so some of you will recognize regression from a statistics class or econometrics class that you had. And this is an algorithm that's being used for artificial intelligence. And in this case, there was a lot of data gathered by Metrics. They found that they could put together a regression model to predict what a person's fee would be. So for example, if you go into the app that they had, if you're a lawyer in Chicago doing M&A work, 1,000-lawyer firm with 30 years of experience, a partner, it would tell you that the rate in 2012 on average is $758. And so thinking about all these different ways in which tools that are being used in other spaces could be used to predict different things in the legal space. And this has led to some asking, can we predict case outcomes? Well, the truth is that we as lawyers predict case outcomes all the time. That's what our clients pay us for, is to give them an estimate. What do we think it's going to cost? Where do we think this should settle at? What do we think if it goes to a jury that they'll award? And so figuring out how can we use this data now that's available from Lex Machina, Ravel, case text, fast case. Like there's so much data now available. How can we start making use of that to make better predictions? Even just on something simple, like you'll see one of these is the time it takes to rule on a summary judgment motion, right? That's valuable information. Or if you're representing a defendant and the strategy is really to knock something out on summary judgment. Well, when the case is actually filed and you know that you find out that your judge is half as likely to grant summary judgment compared to the other judges in that district, all things being equal, isn't that really valuable information? Right? More and more that information is available to us and we only need to go look for it. So there's absolutely data available that can help us. Now, one of the things I want you to think about is how do you, before you start getting into thinking about high-end data, how do you today start creating a data-driven culture? Like, there's no excuse for not having this in place right now. How do you start creating metrics for the things you do? How do you capture data? How do you keep score? Now, if you're a lawyer who, when your client asks you for a cost or outcome and you can't tell them what's happened in the past, start keeping score. When you estimate $250,000 in fees and a $2 million recovery, have you went and kept score and then looked at it and asked, well, why? You know, why did I miss or why did I hit it, right? What changed? And this, again, is part of the basic scientific method, right? You're making a prediction. You have a hypothesis about the world. What do you have to do, though, to learn from that? You have to collect the data along the way and then stop and ask yourself, well, did I get it right? Was my hypothesis correct? And if I didn't get it right, why not? That's how we learn, and those are the things we need to do. Those are the things that really set the stage for quantitative prediction and applying artificial intelligence. So being data-driven with these things, right, is just for asking yourself for each decision, what do we want to accomplish? What data do we have? What other sources of data can we use? And then what action do we take in light of this? Right? So it's using data with our anecdotes and intuitions and not jumping to conclusions, not making assumptions. Right? That's what so much of this is. So many opportunities in risk assessment. Frequently as lawyers, we don't go through a proper risk assessment. And you know, our clients more and more are expecting us to do that. Too frequently as lawyers, we identify risks and then we aim to eliminate those risks, right? That's what we're trying to do. So it's like identify and eliminate risk. And what clients really want us to do is not just identify and eliminate or treat, but estimate what's the likelihood of the risk, what would be the impact, right, or the value of the risk, make an evaluation of all those potential risks, and then propose a treatment, discuss a treatment. Right, and that's a discussion then to have with the client, whether it might be the number of depositions to take in a case, or how to write a provision in an important merger agreement, right? So, you know, when I talk about deposition numbers and things like that, sometimes I'll get pushback from lawyers and say, well, we can't commit malpractice. Well, no, of course, there's certain minimum amount of work that you have to do, but it's a discussion with the client about, well, we could add an additional 10 depositions, for example, but what impact is that really going to have? Let's actually assess it. Let's look at the case and figure out what value that's going to provide and let the client make that decision. And then you can use heat maps and different things like that, where you can try to figure out categories. Rather than quantifying things, you can come up with categorical, right? If something's rare, doesn't happen very often, it would have a minor impact, low risk, you don't care about it. Stuff that are extreme impacts, very likely, you better focus on those, things like that, right? Using these tools, too, to display to the client. It makes it easier for the client to understand the information and make a decision. Then you can think about contract risk assessments, and I'm not going to spend much time on this slide, and you'll have the slides later on, but you know, it's a very similar process of walking through. One of the things we talk about a lot in my quantitative classes and also the negotiation classes I teach at the University of Michigan is using decision trees. And Daniel Kahneman wrote a great Harvard Business Review article about this about a year and a half ago, about the noise in the decisions that we make as professionals. And there's bias too, and we got to try to correct for bias and get the bias out of the system. But we also frequently don't recognize the noise in addition in our decisions. And that means you present facts to me today and then present to me a week from now, and my decision might be 20, 30, 40% different. And by using different tools and being systematic, being more rigorous in the things we do, we can help wring some of the noise out of that process by introducing data instead of just relying on anecdotes and intuitions. And by using decision trees, using the heat map I showed, the thing that we do is we're able to level set, make sure all the lawyers on our team, so if we've got a team of lawyers, we're on the same page, and then the client's on the same page. And most of our clients, they've been to business school or They're more used to seeing this stuff inside of the corporations and even individuals, right? How can we be more visual and make it clear to the clients really what their options are and what we're advising? Here's just a couple of slides kind of showing a decision tree in action, right? There's been some great writing, actually. Craig Glidden wrote a great article about decision analysis, decision tree analysis with Mark Victor. So I encourage you to take a look at some of those things. And again, just start with small data. Start thinking about what kind of metrics do you need? What's the value you provide to your clients? So where should you be tracking things? This will be in the slide deck again, just some small data examples. A lot of examples here of nothing's really off the rack. You should be asking about what's important for your organization. But there's definitely some things that you could be putting together a repository of data that would really help you be better at providing value to your client, giving better estimates, knowing better, making better predictions of case outcomes. Just keeping track of all this, total cost to prosecute or defend the case, amount to resolve, duration, just a couple more examples around that. All right, so as we transition then into this last piece, just a quote from Dr. Deming, right, and one of the founders of the quality movement and the predecessor to lean thinking and Toyota production system. And in most other spaces, opinions only count for so much, right? And people are looking for data. And of course, our clients really lean on us to be trusted advisors, and they value our advice. But more and more, they're looking for us to supplement that with data. Not for everything, right? That's for the really, truly highest values. There isn't. It's unprecedented. There isn't any data. But if we're honest about with ourselves, there are fewer and fewer bet the company snowflake issues. Right? We've got a lot of stuff that is repeatable, and we've got a lot of stuff that we should be looking at. How do we use data? And without that data, you're just another person with an opinion. This will be in the slide deck just about the different career pathways. I guess one of the things I want to get across is there are absolutely a need for traditional lawyers to know this stuff. I talked about the rise of legal operations. If you are doing work with companies like Google and you're talking to Mariel Carroll, their legal ops head, or NetApp and you're talking to Connie Brenton, they're going to sit down with you and they're going to ask you questions about how you're using technology and artificial intelligence. General Motors is doing more and more of this, expecting this with their General Counsel Craig Glidden, and we've got a couple of our students now working there, Pat Ellis and Brian Pike. Right? We're seeing the change with legal operations in these organizations, and they're expecting their traditional lawyers to understand how they're using data and technology and process improvement and project management to get them better results. So, and then there's emerging technologies, right? All these opportunities at the intersection of law and technology. And then there's non-traditional lawyers, legal solutions architects, legal data scientists, legal startup founders. The legal startups are hiring lawyers. And again, it's important to have that legal knowledge and then figuring out how to use that to provide better solutions, things like that. And then a whole host of alternative careers. And so the last thing then that I'll talk about here is just, again, I'm going to go back to the kata, right? No assumptions, no jumping to conclusions. We don't know what the right answers are. You might think you know, but you do not. Okay? We got to try things. We got to get input from our clients and from other users. Think about using tools like the business model canvas to think about how you really differentiate yourself and provide value. Think about a book like The Startup of You. It's a great book, right? You got to have a plan. I don't think you can be too narrow. Shoot for the stars. You should have big, big goals. And on that path, then you might find that you pivot and you try something else, fall into something else that you really like, right? But I think those are that's some of the thinking that can really lead you to success. So in this last slide here, just showing some of my background information, I blog at legaltechlever.com. I did a research project on legal tech innovation, looked at the top 260 law firms in the world. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. And you can find me on LinkedIn, and I'm on Twitter. So, I hope you've been tweeting at me maybe a couple of times during the program. And I'd look forward to hearing from any of you if you have follow-up questions, and I look forward to getting the slides out to you.
Thank you so much, Professor Linna, for highlighting disciplines and skills that lawyers need today in order to be innovative and successful, and for providing the kata, the practical framework within which to execute them. And thank you all for attending today's webinar. Attendees, please be sure to check out our website at ambar.org/careers for upcoming free career-related articles and webinars. On your screen right now are some of our upcoming webinars in the Career Advice series. You can also be sure to check out our job board, and you can connect with us on social media. And also, you can check out our About page to read more about our board. Thank you again for joining us today. Please complete our short survey before leaving. Have a great day.